Hi, I'm Paisley Rekdal.
Hi, I'm Carol Edgarian.
And I guess we're just going to start talking about ideas of displacement. So, Carol, you just wrote a book, Vera, a novel, I love this novel so much. I just finished a book, or I just published a book, Appropriate, a Provocation. So we're going to talk about a lot of things about representation. We're going to talk about even the idea of displacement, which I think is a good place to start. So if we want to even think about what the term displacement means, what does it mean for you?
Well, let's go to the source of what the definition is, which I think is so evocative when we were scheming about this about this talk. So just a couple of the definitions, and there are many, but one is, to move someone from one place to another, to move something. And then there's a whole psychological aspect of an unconscious transfer of emotion that belongs in one place to another person. And I think we could certainly talk for an hour about that, about displacement. But something I think also to bring in the room is how we are living in an era of displacement right now, whether it's COVID and all our lives have been displaced, all the lost lives, all the patterning. Certainly we're witnessing in Ukraine. 7 million people, I think, was the last number I heard of being refugees, and I think that's an undercount. And then even this week, the news of the Supreme Court and a displacement of what many of us thought was a given in our society, and all the ripple effects. On and on. So let's talk about story, but story is always alive and moving, as you've written so beautifully about.
One of the things, I should add about displacement, it's, when I was doing research for a book of mine called The Broken Country, which is all about basically Southeast Asian refugees post-1975, the Vietnam War. One of the things that I learned was actually right now we're in the largest refugee crisis in history. We have over 55 million displaced people from climate, from wars, genocides, and of course Ukraine is obviously adding to that.
Yep.
And the climate crisis cannot be downplayed at all. A lot of the migrants that are moving now are directly moving because of questions of they can't survive in their own countries. So there's lots of ways in which we're living in an era of displacement. But I like what you also said about the pandemic, in which we're all sort of displaced as well, even if we have not necessarily moved. We've been removed psychologically from places where we think we're supposed to be.
Yeah, our patterns.
Our patterns, our workplace, our communities, and things like that. And I was just talking with my friend Gloria about the ways in which there's a sense of lawlessness that we're sort of experiencing, where people seem to be behaving in more erratic manners, and I can't help but feel like that's sort of kind of one of the things around displacement is it's not just a physical movement, it's a psychological disruption, right?
Yeah, and I know we talked. Maybe to talk our story. Would be a way to start of how we both came to really. Do you want to dive in?
Actually, I think you should talk about it first, because your novel absolutely deals with displacement. And just to answer a little bit for you, your novel is set during the 1906 earthquake. Mm-hmm. You've got people from a variety of different social, economic, racial groups that are upended from their particular worlds, and they all kind of get thrown together in these really surprising ways. So you want to talk about your novel? Sorry.
Well, I think what has been so interesting as we've talked about this is really all of your work has an aspect of that, has a root of that, as mine does as well. And I think where it begins for me is, my father was the first generation Armenian survivor of the genocide. And that story, what are the stories when you are displaced? How is that story told? How is it held in a family? How is the trauma held in a family? I can't help looking at the news. And to your point about climate change, it's just the beginning of that story. And on the other side, my mother was alcoholic parents taken from her parents and put in an orphanage at the age of 5, where she remained till the day she turned 18. So the notion for me that I've been working out in these books, not autobiographically, but what's underneath, what propels the writer, what are those questions? It's always been sort of, where is home? And what does it mean to belong when you don't belong? And in Armenian, there's the word odar, which means outsider. And it is by definition a displaced person, right? So in Vera, I'll say a little bit about that and pass the baton. In Vera, I really want to look at this moment. This was in 1906, San Francisco. It was a moment of great corruption in the city of San Francisco. The mayor was going to be indicted the morning of the quake, and instead he got the quake, which was a gift from the gods, and kept him out of the slammer for a year. But it was also a moment where to be, you were defined by society, and these boxes people were put in were pretty immovable. A quake and 4 days of fire not only destroyed the city, but it destroyed those constructs. And one of the things in the book that was really interesting for me to look at is there an opportunity in a catastrophe to reinvent yourself and to form new coalitions that wouldn't have been allowed otherwise? And in displacement, there is also a shuffling that goes on. And that, I think, really speaks to what a lot of your work.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because, I hadn't even thought of that as a strain of my work until we were talking about it a bit. And, we share something a bit in common, which is that we come from, families that are mixed in many ways, mixed culturally, mixed racially. So half my family is Chinese and half is Norwegian, mix of white. And within, on both sides, they're both immigrants and fairly recent immigrants to America. And so I kind of grew up with this idea that no one ever quite belonged with anybody. And I myself never quite belonged with any particular group either. I was always sort of, depending on who I was speaking to or who I was around, I became one thing or another thing. And it felt as if I was always being asked to choose. And I think the reality for me around identity is that most of us, encapsulate, incorporate so many different narratives, and we live with all of these things, and we keep them sort of whole in our own bodies, in our own minds, but we don't get to actually inhabit that complexity for others. And so I think so many of the projects that I've taken on have been, thinking about what happens to people when they are either physically or psychologically moved from one state of being to another. And this new book that I've written about on cultural appropriation, weirdly, is all about what happens when we, what is literature, but in a way, a kind of willing displacement of the self onto somebody else, or the idea that one might be able to imaginatively not inhabit, but approximate someone else's experience or take that in some ways. And that has some great ethical charges to it, right? If you get it wrong.
Talk a little bit about that, because it's so smart what you... And what I love in the book that you talk about is how even the line... Even it's evolving moment to moment to moment. So what is cultural appropriation in one time is shifting, and I love that nuance that you gave it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about just from writing the book is how we have so many different types of practices around appropriation in the term appropriation itself, and some of these things are things that we encourage ourselves to do as writers, as artists, as people in the world. And anything from adapting a Greek myth or a Shakespeare play, or incorporating the stories that our parents told us from their own cultures and reworking it into these new ways, like that's a motif appropriation that we're like, that's understandable. And then you get to the worst kinds of appropriation where someone's appearing in blackface, or someone is taking somebody else's artifacts and displaying it as their own material, their own kind of art practice. And, the word appropriation itself just lumps all of this in together. So teasing this out makes me understand, like, are there ways in which we not only accept this practice, but it can come to some sort of useful, almost ethical practice in itself? And I want to go back to something you just said that I thought was so smart, which is this idea that we could rebuild coalitions once old orders fall. And I thought that there's a writer named Cristina Rivera Garza who wrote this wonderful essay called Disappropriation. And she talks about how oftentimes we're siloed into political views and experiences without being able to share across these lines. And one thing that appropriation weirdly does is allow us to sort of see ourselves as holding ideals in common, struggles in common, because we can sort of say, in sharing your story or you sharing my story, we recognize there might be some similarity there. And it's funny because when I started writing this book, I started with the idea that appropriation was always bad. But by the end of it, I felt that the culture had shifted so much that everyone was like, appropriation is nothing but bad. I was like, well, wait a minute. There might be something there.
Well, that's what I love what you did. And if you haven't read this book, please go get it. It's just brilliant. And you not only brought your thought to it, you brought your heart to it. And how one thing that among the many things you said, but one thing that was really helpful as a check for me as a novelist when I'm writing about different cultures and looking at story from the point of view of what can I show that gives each character, how can I challenge each character to give them their rightful dignity? And you talked about dignity, and you talked about, in many cases, it's where the writer, the questions the writer asks, and the approach and the empathy you bring to the writing.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that practice because one of the characters in your novels is displaced in some ways multiply. And I can't remember his name. He's a
Tom.
Chinese, right? Yeah. So he's Chinese. We might have considered them sojourners, someone who is probably not planning to live in the United States but go back to China. And he comes, and his daughter. He can't have the relationship with his daughter he really wants. Then the earthquake comes, and he's working for this other white woman. He's just like, I'm not sure about this. He experiences multiple forms of displacement just, in this novel, nationally, socially, racially. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you approached, writing so kind of outside, because it's historical fiction as well as, across cultural lines.
Well, I began by thinking, how do you write about San Francisco in 1906 and not talk about Chinatown and Chinese residents in that time? Like, that would be weird. That would be exclusive in a way that
it would be its own moral lapse.
It would be its own moral lapse. Exactly. So how could I create a character who was true to himself and not stereotypical in any way, who was many aspects, complicated character. And as I wrote him, he got more complicated and more interesting to me. But Tan was this Chinese servant to one of the biggest madams of the time. And she was her own ball of complexity. But he knew he was a refined cook. He knew wines. He knew how to run a house. He knew how to run a very high-end brothel. He was the only, you could argue, the only character in the book who was a devoted parent.
Yeah, he definitely was.
And devoted to his father, right? So he had all these attributes, but he was also a Chinese man in 1906. Condemned to live in the basement of a grand house on a dirt floor with a slop jar. And how to hold that complexity and how to give him his dignity by also showing his rage. Yeah. And so he becomes the nemesis of the main character, Vera, and they're dueling throughout the book to an ultimate partnership is sort of became much more central to the book than I'd even imagined. But in that crisis, in the crisis of the quake, it became who was scrappy enough to be counted on.
And that's what I liked about the novel so much, because I think, you know, one of the things that I didn't like about the novel American Dirt, for example, which is also a novel about displacement, and, you know, that was one that was, you know, a lot of charges around cultural appropriation came with that novel. And one of the things that really struck me about your novel is that scrappiness, you know, you respected the characters enough to have them behave quite badly at times, and, you know, to show a lot of agency and a lot of resiliency. And one of the things that really struck me about the American Dirt, you know, imagination of displacement, and these are all, they're women and children that we have to sort of imagine, and there's nothing wrong with showing women and children. Many people who are displaced are women and children. But it was as if all of these women were raped or treated incredibly badly. They were always victimized. They were always traumatized. They were always sort of, in some ways, also portrayed as potentially perfect, docile American subjects just waiting to become American. And that was something that really struck me, which is that in that argument around displacement, it's sort of like they can find a home here in America because they're not threatening, they can be easily assimilated, there's nothing scary about them. One of the children is already fluent in English from watching YouTube videos and things like that. It was a really, and I could see it was meant to be a very liberal and progressive kind of argument around displacement, like open up the borders, let people in. But it was also so contingent on seeing the displaced as having none of that sort of vibrant scrappiness.
Well, when they start wearing placards, you know, when you lose that contradiction that makes us human.
Right.
You know,
exactly.
I think of it as a character's wrong rightness. I mean, you have to give them that, because otherwise they're not flesh and blood.
Yeah.
Something I'd love to hear you talk about is the West, that project, which is
also about displacement. Yeah. So I'm the poet laureate of Utah, and so one of the things they wanted me to do is write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad, and because the Transcontinental completes in Utah, about 100 miles away from my house. And of course, being half Chinese, I said I would be very happy to write them a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. But what I wanted to do was frame that history actually through other languages. So I actually took a Chinese poem that had been carved into the walls of Angel Island, and it's a website, you can go to it, www.westtrain.org. Anyway, but this Chinese poem is on the website, and if you click every character is translated into a poem about the railroad from a worker's point of view, or from the cultural impact of the railroad on the United States. And one of the things that I found so fascinating was that, you know, we frame the Transcontinental as an American project, but it is actually a project that is transnational.
Right.
Every other nation in the world essentially built the railroad, and American wealthy Americans like Stanford, you know, and General Dodge, they benefited from it financially, but it was built by immigrants. It was built by people who, like on the Irish side, fleeing war and famine, and on the Chinese side, fleeing war and famine as well. And then, of course, Union Pacific soldiers, many of them who were recovering from the Civil War, and many African Americans who were fleeing the South, you know, trying to find a place to sort of be free in the West. And so one of the things that I found so fascinating was that, yeah, it becomes a project of displacement, building the idea of nation for themselves and mostly for other people, because, you know, and the people who were writing about the Transcontinental at the time recognized that this was the way you make Americans. The railroad unites. The railroad in its labor practices will make Americans out of all these people. Thoreau in Walden even says, the train runs over sleepers. They are Irish sleepers. They are Polish sleepers. They are Chinese sleepers. They are sound sleepers, I assure you. But he really understood that the physical mechanics of the railroad itself would be built on the bodies of people who were not considered American, but then would be made into Americans. So yeah, I hadn't even thought about it as a project of displacement either, but you're right. I mean, it totally is. But
well, ever thus, I mean, this country was built, right? I mean, what is an American?
Well,
like,
I think, what is?
I mean, you know, we can go a long way about that. You know, one of the things that was interesting in writing Vera was there was the earthquake, and then there was the fire, and the fire wiped out 500 city blocks, including all of Chinatown. And immediately, I mean within 24 hours, some of the wise men of San Francisco thought, aha, we can take, all the deeds were burned.
Right, yeah.
We can take Chinatown, it's prime real estate, and just sort of move the Chinese to Bayview. And plans were afoot, a lot of money to be made, and Shanghai objected. What I would love to know, and my research didn't find out, I need to go down this rabbit hole, but what does that look like when Shanghai objects? Is that a letter? Is that someone coming over? But anyway, they put enough pressure that Chinatown was preserved. But imagine how different the city would be without Chinatown, where it is. And my first novel was about 3 generations of Armenians, the first generation having survived the genocide, and really unearthing what that story was, the story that was not told in my immediate family. And again, all those complexities of displaced persons and which generation really comes forward to talk about it, and where the trauma becomes the silence.
Yeah. It is funny because war, when we think about things that cause displacement, war in your family and war in mine is something that, has also resonated, because one of the things I was thinking about, one of the reasons I wrote so much about Vietnam and the legacy of Vietnam is that my father's a non-combat veteran of Vietnam. My uncle, who's Chinese American, fought in Vietnam and almost died there. And I was always fascinated, neither of them would ever talk about their experiences, but I was always fascinated by the sense of sort of psychic displacement my uncle must have felt, in Vietnam, looking, racially similar, but being utterly not similar in these kinds of ways, listening to the racist kind of rhetoric that was surrounding him, and at the same time, seeing himself, he's very conservative, he's very nationally pro-nation and that sort of thing. So it must have just been a moment of incredible cognitive dissonance. But something that you said, 2 things really strike me. There might be something, I would like to say maybe there's something deeply American about the conversation around displacement, but I don't think so in the ways that the globe works and shifts and stuff like that. But I do think that novels, all stories in some ways are about displacement at some point. If somebody is inside the culture and doesn't feel somehow outside of it, there's no conflict there. Like, displacement is the first form of conflict.
Well, I think displacement is a global issue.
Yeah.
I think perhaps, and I'm just trying this on, I think what is an American issue is the search for home.
Yeah.
I think we as Americans have lost that feeling of home, or that feeling of home is transient right now. It's not based on literal places where you grew up. So many of us move away from there. It's not necessarily community or where you worship. All those old grounding places have shifted for so many of us. And I think that's what I see in a lot of novels today, is that sense of being a wanderer and being yearning to belong somewhere.
It's funny because what you just said reminds me of some research I was doing for my Transcontinental Railroad project, and I was reading the Frontier thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner, and his argument was that in fact Americans don't want a sense of home at all. That's what makes Americans American. He's like, if once the lands of the Upper Yadkin become too familiar, we find a field, we level it. We find a water, we dam it, and then he's like, and then we get bored. As soon as we have domesticated wherever we are, wherever we made a home, the true American, has to go further out into the West, further out into the wilds, because they can't stand it. So his whole argument is that that's not just, it's the argument for manifest destiny. It's like
but do you think that's still true?
I think it's only true in the sense that we are so fascinated by it that it's like a toxic myth we can't get rid of. I was watching Yellowstone, which I don't know if anyone else has
Talk
watched
about
Yellowstone.
highbrow.
I know, because my dad keeps saying, I just think of you out there in Utah living like Yellowstone. He kept saying it. So I was like, what is this Yellowstone? So I started watching it. I was like, no, I don't know. Like, I'm not riding a horse to work. I mean, I'm not shooting or killing anyone. It's just crazy. But that Yellowstone is entirely built on this idea
the myth, absolutely.
That myth, like we're going to preserve this idea that only here can you be really, really wild. But it's that the contradiction of it is so funny too. It's sort of like, I can only be wild if I own 100 million acres to myself. It's like, it's not really wild, is it? It's just yours. So this idea of ownership at the same time of being released into something that frees you. I mean, there's a kind of longing for a displacement, as if that's somehow going to get you more freedom.
But I wonder if that's going to be true now that the American identity is so fractured. Now that that sort of common American myth that if, with a little luck and a lot of push, your children's lives will be better than yours. I mean, all of those things we've lost in the last 20 or 30 years collectively. Both sets of my grandparents were immigrants, and that's absolutely what drove them. And for a long time, that myth seemed to propel a lot of American writing. I think we're done with that one. I think we're done with that one. But what is the new one? What is the new positive thing, the generative thing that we're all, that Americans, it's even a weird word to say, because who is that anymore?
It's okay. I'm like, I think we've left the topic of
We've
the original
displacement.
but I am really fascinated by exactly this kind of question, because if we've reached a point where we don't trust liberal democracy because we no longer trust the institutions because they're so riddled with corruption or racism, or capitalism is inherently and always destined to destroy and to fail, and it's attached, unfortunately, to these liberal democracies. If we believe that about our institutions, I don't know what narrative there is except it's always going to be a disaster. It's always going to be a crisis. It's never going to be positive. And I have to say, I really chafe against both those positions.
Yeah, I do
and the
too.
reason is because if you don't, there may be something we would now think historically maybe sweetly naive about maybe our parents and our grandparents having this idea of America, or having this idea of our institutions. And yet if you don't have that belief, what are you going to do, right? Like, you kind of have to have some level of delusion, maybe. Delusion already, casts it in a negative light, but some sense of idealism to work towards. So I am curious about what you just said. Like, is there an American literature that does not essentially take displacement and crisis as its final end point, but uses displacement moves it into the positive? I will say that's something I thought was really interesting about Vera, which is that, again, in these fragmentary moments, in fact, you see, as we said before, coalition building. It becomes an invitation to become a new society with different kinds of rules.
Well, we can't live in the belly of negation. I
Right,
mean, there's no life there.
No, but there is Netflix.
There's
a lot of Netflix for
Netflix
me.
just had a bad week, so even Netflix.
And I
is
bought
having
more
a-
stock. It was like, we're not at the bottom of that yet.
So I mean, the human desires for connection. It's. I mean, you see this. It's something I certainly saw in my research in the quake and the fire. I mean, people. There was a line in the book, desire is the one renewable source we have on Earth. And so we're always moving toward something, and we're moving toward love. We're moving toward connection. And there's nothing hokey about that.
Yeah,
I mean, I think, I chafe against that, because it's safe to say no.
Yeah, that's how I felt about, weirdly, cultural appropriation at the end. Like, I found that the positions of yes or no were obviously just far too black and white around that kind of thing. But I also found the automatic stay in your lane or the automatic response that appropriation is permanently and only harmful to be its own kind of dangerous fantasy that actually mimicked a lot of this stuff, like the far left and the far right both had the same kind of fantasies of authenticity. This is what it means to be the thing that you think is the person or the body or the identity on the page.
Right.
But that's not really what it is, right? Like, you know, we don't stay crystallized in a particular form, and we're always constantly changing. And there's something very malleable about art that recognizes that identities most display themselves in a process of change,
right.
not in a sort of like outlay of this is the tick that makes me supposedly, you know, Asian or not Asian or something, you know, whatever identity you want to choose. And you know, I do find there's something really kind of moving about the ways in which I think about, you know, like talk about in the book briefly, like how hip hop and American and African American, you know, art form gets picked up in Turkey and it gets picked up in France and gets picked up in places in, you know, in Asia too, as a way of sort of saying like, you know, this art form actually is a way that I can express my own political rage, speaking about my own situation here. And I found that was quite moving.
Yeah, and I mean, that leads me to cancel culture in thinking about, you know, if we open our arms wider, does that mean some people have to get kicked out? Or are we, in fact, embracing more? And in that, it's much easier to say, you know, you don't fit the rubric, out with you, versus I don't agree with that. You know, I don't agree with this, and then there's some kind of back and forth, and I don't know. I think it's easier to hold things in a rigid way when things feel too complex, when they feel too contrary. It's just a too muchness that I know I'm feeling in the world, and I'm sure many of you are feeling that. And so, you know, like, are there hard and fast rules? And what I loved in your book was you acknowledged in the beginning there aren't hard and fast rules, and then you kept working that, and the nuance you brought to it was amazing. And that another book's going to be written, probably, maybe by you, in 5 or 10 years, because we're going to be in a different place.
Right, that's the thing that's funny about it. You know, whenever you think you have an idea about what identity is, what sexuality is, what gender is, what race is, we shift and we change again. And in that sense, you know, we're always, I mean, just thinking about the positives of displacement. Again, we're just thinking about if displacement is about moving something out of one context, putting it somewhere where maybe we would not expect it to be, that's kind of what we're doing all the time anyway.
Yeah.
And there's something about that becomes a fundamentally creative act, not just one that is destructive, if that makes sense.
Right, because if you're in a new place, what are the first things you do? And there is the story of, did you choose the new place?
Yeah.
Or was it chosen for you?
Yeah.
Very different construct. Yeah. But if you're in a new place, then what are the actions, and what does it change you fundamentally in perhaps a positive way, that it opens you up to new possibilities, new coalitions, new family? Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I think that may be what the next stories are about, because we can't keep living in negation. And story, by definition, is positive. It is generative. It's going back to the earliest days around the campfire and saying, this is what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And by saying that, you're both claiming your space, and you're claiming the greater story, right? Yeah. You're hearing what it is. And so that you don't tell a story by what didn't happen.
No, that's a poem. Should we open it up to questions?
Yeah, where are we?
Yeah, I don't know where we are. Probably we're right at time, or we're not.
I don't know.
We got 25 minutes? Oh, wow, we got a little bit of time. We could take some questions, or we can just keep yapping.
And we can keep, we can.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, that's a good
That is a
question.
good question.
It was really, there were Chinatown, there was a Dutch community, there was a big Irish community. In my research, I kept, where were the African Americans? It wasn't a huge population at that time. It was a lot of mixtures of other folks. Railroad brought a lot of people, the miners,
Mining, yeah.
who got that far? I mean, it wasn't easy to get to San Francisco. Because San Francisco in 1906 was really kind of still the Wild West. I mean, it was coming up, but, just a few years earlier, it had been the most murderous town in all of the U.S. So I don't have those facts handy. I know. And isn't this interesting that, sections of town were devoted to different ethnic groups and not a lot of mixing? It still is.
Mm.
Was it a Hispanic group at that time? Any Mexican?
There were, yes, but nowhere like there is now.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for your dialogue. I am interested in what we pass down to the next generation in a time of displacement. My father was a refugee from Nazi Germany. That was our family story, and I've explored how food is one of the things, and the cheesecake that's been served over a century, right? How do I pass that down? Because for my nieces, it's ancient history, and things are moving so quickly. So and Edmund de Waal has written about the Netsuki, right? So
Yeah.
what do you both have to say about heritage passing things down in the 21st century in a time of displacement?
So I wrote this book, The Broken Country, on trauma, crime, and the continuing legacy of Vietnam. And this is going to be a dark answer, and then I'll go to something happier. This is a book entirely focused on a crime that happened near my house, where a young post-1975 refugee from Vietnam, a young man named Kit Tan Le, who would not have been alive during the Vietnam War. And he had problems with drugs and alcohol, and anyway, he had had mental illness issues for much of his life that were exacerbated by drugs. Anyway, he went to this grocery store near my house, and he bought a knife, and he went into the parking lot and started stabbing all of these white men while screaming about the Vietnam War, a war which he himself did not, directly experience. And I had been living in Vietnam at the time, and I'd heard about this story, and one of the men he stabbed was actually a student in our English department at the University of Utah, and I was fascinated by this, because that was one of the questions, which is why would he have that? I think one of the easy things, people would dismiss that crime automatically and say, well, he was clearly on drugs. It's a fantasy, it's a fabrication. But I wanted to take seriously a question of how much do we inherit that we are not conscious of? I mean, how much of, transgenerational trauma is something I think now we're much more familiar with. The idea that, in fact, something that happens to somebody changes our RNA, potentially, and that can be heritably passed down. One of the things that I was discovering in my research was actually how high the mental illness rates were for Southeast Asian refugees, and they tracked across the globe. Wherever Vietnamese refugees settled, there was an elevated uptick in problems around mental illness, and it was probably underreported because these were communities that were very suspicious of therapeutic communities from the West, and also might not have had the language to describe exactly what was going on. They also tracked veterans of the Vietnam War, and they also similarly tracked these, same sorts of transgenerational trauma issues. So a veteran, their child is more likely, if that veteran was traumatized, that child is more likely to display a lot of different symptoms, everything from sort of abuse and addiction to violent tendencies and things like that. And it really makes me, one of the things that I'm always thinking about now was based on some of that research. I mean, they're trying to track now what's going to happen to the people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. They think that it's like a 40-year war, basically a 40-year cycle that happens after war. And I think that there's going to be something around the pandemic too. Like, how has this not just rewired some parts of our remembrances, our memories? How has it rewired some part of our bodies? And that's the dark side, I think. But there's other things that I think become part of the good side, I think, of inheritance. And I think your example is a wonderful one, the idea of the cheesecake recipe. These ways in which culture, it's sort of larded through us in all of these ways, in these surprising ways, and being able to give voice to something, some memory via food, via song, via scraps of language or something, or stories that get woven also into us, that they become part of our own embodied life. I think that I find that quite beautiful. But I think that that's one of the things that's so fascinating to me about inheritance and this, is that we're not totally consciously in control of it. They kind of come unbidden, and they get woven in to this, like, our physical fabric and our mental fabric.
I think I love what you just said, and I wouldn't give up on the cheesecake.
Yeah, no, the cheesecake.
Because I don't think you
Yeah.
don't know where that seed is going to take root and grow, and in whom.
Yeah.
You know, my story. So my grandmother was the head of the Armenian church in Connecticut, and what was that about? It was about taking in refugees from the genocide. And what did my father do in reaction to that? He married a Swedish orphan, and he broke his mother's heart. He was the only one of his generation to marry a non-Armenian. So we didn't look pure. We weren't pure. We were even my cousins of my generation all married Armenians. And it wasn't until I was 20, and my father would never talk about the genocide. And I didn't really know about the genocide. And when I was 20, I was living in France. I had gone to France thinking I knew how to speak French. And the French really quickly taught me that I didn't know how to speak French, and I was having a very tough time. And I had a dream. I got sick with bronchitis. This is so strange. And I had a dream. And in the dream, a woman was speaking to me in Armenian, and I completely understood her. And that was the beginning of that novel, Rise to the Euphrates, which is about a genocide survivor, a survivor as a child, who not only loses her family, and talk about displacement, her home and everything, she loses her name, which what do we have that is most essential? Our names. And the two generations that follow, and what is the legacy, not just in terms of trauma, but what is the legacy in terms of food and language and music and the gifts of culture. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we know. Like, why did that happen? And that, that was the next 10 years of my life, writing that book, researching it, and figuring it out. So I don't give up on your nieces.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. I mean, I have to say, just thinking as a teacher, one of the things that I always remind myself of as a teacher is that you're teaching in the hopes that something is going to land. I mean, you don't know. People are going to learn when they're ready to learn that lesson. And one of the things around, as a poet, primarily, one of the things that really strikes me is that oftentimes, I think most people think poetically. They start to make those connections. Yeah. They start to, over time, they start to say, why does this remind me of that? And in doing that, they lock together these narratives, and they sort of recreate them in a way. So that is, I find, something very hopeful.
I do too. I do too. And it's wondrous where it comes up. Where, and also, I mean, I think I wonder if you've all experienced this, but I've been practicing yoga for like 25 years, and you go to, back in the days when we went to class, and they would say the same thing over and over.
Yeah.
Make sure your hand, like over and over, and then like one day, it's like, oh, my hands. oh, that suddenly made sense. Like, you know, in
You have
that,
to be ready for the lesson.
you have to be
Yeah.
ready for the lesson of what, so, yeah.
Yeah. You had a question, and a bunch of people have questions.
Oh, good.
Thank you for that intriguing conversation. It was really insightful. You talked about the rigidity of we kick someone out of the rubric, and you mentioned the idea of positivities of cultural appropriation. Some people distinguish between cultural appreciation and
Yes.
appropriation. Does that make sense to
It
you? What
totally
is
does.
the difference? So in your criticism
Yeah.
of cultural appropriation, how do you tackle that fine balance?
That's a great question.
It is a great question, and there is a book that answers it, so unfortunately, I will try and boil it down. One of the things that I think the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation resides on the willingness and the understanding, the willingness to believe in the understanding that finally you cannot essentially make somebody else you, which means oftentimes when I read in literature, I see in art a kind of work of appropriation that I find kind of harmful or damaging, it's usually because the writer, A, has equated racial characteristics that are external with interior and unbridgeable difference, racial difference, which is to say anytime someone has this physical appearance, they're going to display these particular types of behaviors. That is a one-to-one correlation that doesn't exist, right? The other thing that they tend to do is they don't tend to think representatively, which is to say all of us have feelings of desire and rage and jealousy, right? We all have that, but we can't express it the same ways. With my students, I say, you know, remember when Brett Kavanaugh was on the stand and he was trying to get, you know, on the Supreme Court, and he got mad, he started thumping his hand and yelling and screaming how unfair it was. And I was like, you know, now it's a very different scenario, but when Ketanji Brown was, you know, Jax Brown was up on on the stand and being asked all these kinds of questions, did you see her thumping her hand and screaming? No, right? I'm pretty sure she was upset too at some of the questions that she was getting and the grilling she was getting. But, you know, as a black woman, she's not going to be able to express it in those ways because she's highly aware of how that's going to be read and seen. And I say that, you know, when we're thinking representatively, what we're thinking about is how would I, in a very different body, in a very different set of social and historical circumstances, be able to express the emotions that I know we all do share in humanity. And that starts to understand that race is not a series of tics. Identity is not a series of, you know, absolutes. It's a performance that it changes moment to moment depending on the context in which you're in. And literature, I think, really capitalizes on the idea of change and performance. That's, you know, if everyone behaves the exact same way all the way through the book, no changes happen. There's no story, right? And so I think of that as a moment of cultural appreciation, you know, a cultural approximation, which is we're not going to get it right. You can't get it right, you know, entirely. But you can certainly respect the ways in which our human imaginations are shaped by historical and social forces that we're not in control of. So even though we can all agree race in itself is a social construct, it has mortal consequences for people too. It has real effects in the world. And recognizing that we move between the imaginary and the real all the time in these ways, I think is just a very, very easy but very difficult step to take. I think it's easy to say, it's hard to kind of remind ourselves to do it. Yeah.
It's a very interesting and helpful conversation, I have to say. I'm curious about your attitudes towards representing non-standard Englishes. It seems so important to, you know, represent the richness of English and the creativity with which people speak, but this is really a kind of danger zone as well in the past for absolute misrepresentation of.
I'm so glad you asked that. And I have an answer, but I want to hear you first, because you really had to invent whole cloth. People.
Yeah, it's really, it's the third rail right now. It really is. So how to write characters who speak a mixture of and in my career that, my God, now spans, you know, 40 years. This has really changed. It's radically changed. Today, as someone who appears white, identifies as white, I cannot write in certain dialects or certain that's just not, it's not okay. And there has to be deciding places where, out of respect, you don't go. But then the challenge is, how do you create a rich character who, in the reader's ear, you hear it? It's a much bigger challenge. How do you hear that character's distinctive voice in dialogue? And that was really a challenge. It was really a challenge with Vera in a way that I hadn't really thought about a lot of that with my first novel. I mean, there's so many things that are new that are better. For example, if you go back and look at novels written even 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, you will find that if it's a white author, 9 times out of 10, only the people whose skin is not white will be described.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The assumption being that the reader is white. Now, think how that is not going to fly anymore, nor should it, right? Wake up. But all these things are evolving, and we have to evolve with them. We have to, as storytellers, again, the arms wider. I want to hear how you answer that too.
Yeah, so I have the West Train project on the Transcontinental. It is an entirely appropriative project, which is to say that, like I said, almost every single poem, because it opens up into a worker's experience or the cultural impact of the railroad, I used 19th century sources a lot, but I also used oral histories. There were a lot of African-American porters working on the transcontinental line in the middle part of the 20th century, and there was a great oral history archive that I found at the UMass Boston. So I read through hundreds and hundreds of pages of these stories, and so I knew I was going to create a poem that was composed solely of their voices. I did the same thing with Irish Americans, or Irish immigrants at that time. Hundreds and hundreds of these pages of these letters, trying to figure it out and approximate the voice. And it was exactly this question, which is, okay, I want to actually preserve not just the stories that they're telling, but the ways they're telling it. And one of the things that I started doing was, like, I knew I was going to have to come up with my own private set of ethics, because there is no handbook on this. So I said, okay, well, with those who have no other record but the oral history, I'm going to be much more faithful, because overwriting their story would have a much harder, it's a little bit less fair. I mean, I can do what I want to Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote about the Transcontinental, because he's got, buckets of books. So he can stand on his own. So I wanted to be more faithful to what they're telling, but I also recognized that I had to edit down quite a bit, because a single oral history will go on for pages, but the kernel of the story can only, be maybe 50 lines or so, or 15 lines. They also couldn't say anything in a dialect that they themselves did not use. So that's important, because I think one of the things that gets wrong about dialect is that it gets overblown. We want to exoticize the speech.
Right.
For me, it wasn't about the story was more important than the speech patterns, but the speech patterns that I preserved had to do something for the rhythm of the story itself. So, like, for instance, there were a couple of guys who would say, they would keep saying, I'm not lying to you, I'm not lying to you. Or this one guy kept saying, an outstanding citizen like that, what would happen to me? An outstanding citizen like that. He brought it up like 4 or 5 times. So it was like, I would preserve that as a sort of dialectical, speech pattern to sort of give him character, because that's how he was representing himself too, and it became its own repetend. And in other cases, I was like, I'm not gonna over, use the ain't or this or that, because I don't want to make this sort of like, let's look at somebody who didn't get a college education speaking. I wanted it to be like, what is the story they're telling? And the story they were telling was often one of real canniness and resilience and ways of getting around a lot of the racist policies on the railroad. So I spent time focusing in on, what kind of stories that, with this, minimal use of dialect that they themselves had, how could I make sure that I preserved enough of their individuality on the page? That was the strategy I used, at least.
A lot of it is cadence and
Cadence, yeah.
cadence modulation, to give each character a distinctive tone on the
Yeah.
page. You know, quickly, because I know I think
just
we
out of
have
time.
time for one more question, but the amazing actor who recorded my audio book, the audio version of Vera, which was a very hard book because there are so many
Voices,
people
yeah.
and so many voices. And we've become really good friends. Kate Mazer, she's just brilliant. And I said to her, how do you do the different accents, the different tones? And she said that she thinks about each character, and she really thinks about each character. And she says she changes the shape of her mouth. And I loved that, that she changes the shape of her mouth for each character, how she holds. And to your question, that's what it's about now.
One last. Okay.
Hi, so you had mentioned about sort of wearing different masks with different people, and I wanted to know, when you're writing as an author, did you have to code switch, keeping in mind the target audience, or did you get any feedback saying that, sure, your community can understand this, but the mainstream community, you need to rework or rewrite that? So how do you deal with that?
I love how you just looked at me there. Because that is a great question, and it's a perpetual one where you're trying to figure out that balance. Where how is it that who is your ideal audience besides Oprah Winfrey's book club at this point? You know, who are you writing for? And if you start writing for this homogenous idea of a white America, do you then sell out your own voice? Do you somehow water it down? Do you not, do you lose that? And for me, I found myself in my book Appropriate, I actually was going to write it as a series of essays, and then it came to me that no, I knew I was speaking to a very particular kind of person, because usually a lot of people are interested in this question, but it's usually the one who's getting it in the neck because they're getting it wrong is usually a well-meaning white kid, right?
Yeah.
And so I did address the letters to that person. And it had two effects for me. Obviously, one is that, it goes and speaks potentially to that quote-unquote homogenous mass, but it also made me have to articulate very carefully some of the things that I would have taken as a given that somebody else might understand. And I think that actually strengthened the book, because when I thought about it, my students of color would have an innate personal experience with these things, but they wouldn't necessarily have the theoretical language to talk about what that meant. So it actually helped in that moment too. But it also made me realize, what would that person ask that maybe a student of color wouldn't? And then I would also think of a student of color like being angry in the response or the question itself. And so I kind of actually felt that being biracial at that moment helped me situate that pretty well, because I was able to sort of say, I know what you would ask, and I know how you'd feel about that question, and be able to sort of talk across each other, but use me as the conduit. And I guess that's a long way of saying, I think when we're writers, we are kinds of conduits, right? Like, we are kind of always translating, even to our own communities. We're translating our own experiences to them. That, that it might be a sort of a fantasy to sort of think that just because you share something with the same audience, that they actually understand what you're going through and what you've talked about. There's always that aspect of translation.
Yeah. Are we?
done? Okay.
Thank you. These are great
Thank you.
questions.
Those
Thank
are great
you.
questions.